lot of socialists who didn't previously sort of talk in this sort of social justice-y way or have sort of those kind of identitarian tendencies. But after 2016, they got sick of being called racist and sexist for supporting Bernie, and they gone and got religion.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Freddie deBoer is a journalist who has written for many mainstream publications and who now has a successful Substack career. His new book, How Elites Ate the Social Justice Movement, is due out on September 5th from Simon & Schuster. Freddie, welcome back to the Diet Soap podcast.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
Now, let's start talking about your book. How did elites eat the social justice movement? Or put differently, what is an elite and just what did they all eat?
Sure. So the book describes a particular moment in left history, meaning the 2020 and the immediate history of what happened from there, sort of how that we built up to that moment, and the ways in which all of that populist energy and that sort of the street protests, the sense of a very organic sort of social movement eventually got sucked up into the machinery of various sort of elite institutions and enterprises and was sort of dissipated. But the book's argument is that this is not an exception in the history of the American left, that this has been, in fact, a recurring feature of American activism and organizing. So the elites are a variety of different institutions, is who I'm sort of pointing the finger at in American life. For example, there is a chapter on the nonprofits, right? The nonprofit industrial complex. So, these are organizations that have special tax status that enables them to be able to be exempt from most taxes so that they can contribute to some sort of charitable purpose. And, I refer to them, not borrowing a term from other people, as the sort of nonprofit industrial complex, right? Mm-hmm. And that to me is, I would say maybe that's the most important chapter in the book, because central to the whole thing is the idea that you don't have to knowingly want to rob a political movement of its organic energy to participate in doing so. And no one is sort of more in that position than the nonprofit organizations. Nonprofits are in many ways essential to the work that we do in left activism. So I've recently left New York City, but for 6 years or so, I worked with a nonprofit doing organizing in the tenants' rights space in New York City. And they do a lot of really good things. They contribute organization that's necessary to do things like when we would go to Albany to yell at legislators, they would be the ones who would organize the buses. If we're going to do a demo where there was the chance of getting arrested or we're getting arrested was the point, they would be the ones who would have the infrastructure necessary to get people out of jail after they got arrested. Nonprofits are able to create at least some of the organization that has been lacking in a lot of prominent sort of left spaces. So most notoriously Occupy, where structure and demands and other kind of elements of organization that most people would think are essential were sort of actively rejected, which, to the surprise of no one, sort of resulted in Occupy not really going anywhere. But there's a dark side to all of this, which is that institutions always fundamentally serve institutional needs more than anything else. And they have a way of functioning as sort of the sort of finger-wagging parent of the American left activist community, right? If you are at a demo and you have some sort of violence breaks out, the institutional sort of actors who are the most likely to be saying, "Don't do that," or or let's be reasonable, or don't get too crazy. The ones who are most likely to say that are the nonprofits in many cases, because they feel that they might be in some way liable for what happens. There's cases in which nonprofits have been found like literally legally liable for the behavior of protesters at certain events, but also just in the broader sense that they have to answer to a board and they have to maintain their tax status, and they sort of have to maintain a sort of veneer of respectability, and so they tend to be the ones telling people to calm down and to slow down. Beyond that function, they have a habit of sort of sucking people up who are sort of vital and committed activists and just turning them into bureaucrats and functionaries. So one of the kind of mind-bending elements of 2020 is once it became clear that this was a real thing and institutions in American life wanted to sort of put their stamp on it. So Planned Parenthood is putting out a defund the police statement, and investment banks are putting out statements of solidarity with protesters, and the military is talking about creating a safe space for Black bodies, et cetera, et cetera. One of the ways that a lot of these nonprofits responded to is by cutting checks to people to bring them on, right, to onboard them as employees. And this did result in a lot of young, politically oriented Black and brown people getting steady work, which is nice. But the problem is that you had this recurring phenomenon where literally you would have someone in the streets for an entire week, and then the following week they'd be sitting at a desk filling out forms, right? So there's a tendency for what happens a lot is people to get pulled into the apparatus of the institution, and completely independent of their passion or their leftist credentials or their desire to create change, they sort of just become these functionaries. I have a friend who was the executive director of a nonprofit, a sort of activism and organizing focused nonprofit in New York City, and she left after years there. And she just said, like, she had shown up with this desire to sort of turn the system upside down and to be a radical. And all her time was spent glad handing donors. All her time was spent working with the board. And that's sort of inherent to institutions.
Inside.
Foreclose that Tristan Law.
The School of Materialist Research is a self-sustainable platform where ideas are discussed in ways that would not be possible in conventional academia. The school is defined by its interest in the materialist approach to knowledge. Among its faculty are Julia Kristeva, Amanda Beach, Ben Woodward, Thomas Nail, and Paul Cockshott. The deadline for applications is September 4th, 2023. Check out the link to the School of Materialist Research in the description for this video.
The obverse of that is sort of anti-Iraq stuff.
Right.
I don't regret doing it. It was formative in a lot of ways. We were right about everything. But and I think that there would have been no point in trying to do a sort of electoralist approach at that point. Because,
I don't know. I mean, I was part of the anti-war movement in the early 2000s after 9/11, right? And one of the things that I was dealing with in Portland was the fact that the Portland Peaceful Response Coalition originally passed a rule or a statement or something. I don't know exactly what they were internally, but they declared that it was not going to be a political organization, right? They were going to stay out of politics, and which meant that it was very difficult for PPRC to speak to the politics of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. Like what I wanted to see happen is for the peace movement a year out from the invasion of Iraq to be very dedicated to challenging the sanctions on Iraq, saying we shouldn't be directly right now opposing a war that hasn't even been sold yet to the American people. We know it's coming. somehow the peace movement knew it was going to come. But we should instead be trying to change the terrain of electoral politics in the country and be part of a movement to pressure politicians to end the sanctions on Iraq, which even if we lose would change the context of what the debate was around Iraq, or at least somewhat. And that, I think that's kind of thinking like in an electoral way when you try to design so it would have been possible to try to play that kind of political game on a national level, I think, with the peace movement. But instead, we were just committed to trying to have the most universally positive face with as little controversy as possible, while opposing the most popular war in American history, probably up to that point. I mean, at least in my lifetime. So anyway, so I do think you could have had an electoral approach to the peace movement.
I mean, I guess I just don't think it would have made any difference, right? Like John Kerry, in 2004 was sort of running to be as hawkish as George W. Bush, right? Like once we were entered into the war, the Democrats weren't going to say that they were opposed to it. I don't know if you noticed or if you got to that point yet, but in the book I mentioned, one of the things I said is like I could get into the role of answer in the anti-war movement, but we'd be here all day. I mean, so I think this might be interesting to your listeners, but it's just speaking as a guy who was 21 years old when he started doing all this. So maybe I'm not the most informed guy. Certainly I wasn't on the ground where answer was, but it just seemed that answer, it was just one day, like answer just was the closest thing to a sort of institutional face of the anti-war movement, which is weird because my recollection is that they were just this is Act Now to Stop War and End Racism coalition. They were just a fairly obscure Maoist group. But one of the things that just kept coming up over and over again, I got serious in 2002 and probably went until 2006. It was just always like there was always the answer question, right? Like endless debating about whether or not answer was the right face for sort of, being the sort of the nonprofit, the 501(c) that was behind a lot of the big marches and things. And then on top of that, like, look, like this is probably very much a sort of local Connecticut thing, but we were all forever attaching a Palestine demand to the Iraq demands, and the constant accusation was that doing so was splintering what was available for the sort of anti-war coalition. Connecticut has a lot of weird internal factions politically in general, and one of them is West Hartford, which is a home to a lot of sort of moneyed, left-leaning Jewish people, and there was this sort of sense like, will we lose West Hartford? If I guess my point is just that, like, just as there were all kinds of sort of individual coalitional sort of dramas and issues with getting the Housing Safety and Tenant Protection Act passed in New York, there were all kinds of weird coalitional things and infighting and questions about who the right leader should be. But there was just no stakes in the Iraq side because we didn't have a lever of power, right? There was no lever to push.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So that's interesting because going back to the housing fight, I have a couple questions about that, and then we'll move on to more general things. When it comes to rent stabilization and limiting the landlords, the reason I'm thinking of this is because levers of power, there's like two sides to the levers of power in politics. There's the political will, there's the politicians, there's what you can get politicians to pass in terms of policy, and then there's the economic conditions that set limits on at least what the outcomes of those policies will be. So, like, if you limit the landlord's ability to raise rents, what is the relationship between that stabilization policy and, say, property taxes or inflation?
Sure. So I mean, the constant sort of mainstream economics or neoliberal or what have you claim is that rent stabilization ends up raising the rent for everyone who's not stabilized. So there's about 1 million rent stabilized units in New York City, and maybe 1.1 million market rate units at this point. If I am current with that knowledge, there's also the claim that, you know, landlords won't keep up the buildings, whatever. Without debating the sort of broader point, the research on New York City specifically says that is not true for the case of New York City. That the various negative effects that are attributed to rent stabilization don't actually show up in the empirical data about New York. And one of the reasons that's proffered is just that, like, the rent is so high everywhere anyway. In other words, it's swamped out by whatever effects the rent stabilization might have on raising rents on other people, that, like, the rents would just be high anyway because, you know, of the geographical constraints and things like that. Property taxes is interesting. I mean, if I own a property in New York, I probably wouldn't say that the property taxes are low, but the property taxes actually are fairly low for a city of New York's size. So in the 1970s, during the financial emergency, Staten Island came very close to leaving New York and becoming part of New Jersey, which actually might make sense if you look at a map. Like, it just looks like it belongs in New Jersey and not New York. But the city, you know, really didn't want that to happen, didn't want to lose a tax base, and also thought that it would be symbolically too crushing of a blow. So they struck a deal with leaders in Staten Island. Staten Island has just a dramatically higher rate of owner-occupied buildings than anywhere else in the city. And so they figured out a deal where the property taxes are sort of held artificially low in order to please people in Staten Island and keep them in the fold of being part of New York City. So this has enabled things like, in my old neighborhood, Prospect Lefferts Gardens, you have a lot of families, Black families, families of Caribbean descent, who have multi-million-dollar homes, even though no one in the family has ever had anything like that amount of money, because they bought the house in 1960 or whatever, and they've been able to pass it down from generation to generation. And the artificially low property tax enables them to stay, the families to stay in those buildings rather than sort of having to sell them out from under them. I mean, I'm probably not the best person to make, like, the economic case for rent stabilization, but I'll say this, you know, if you ended rent stabilization tomorrow, by the next month, there would be hundreds of thousands of evictions in New York City. I mean, that whatever you want to say about the macroeconomic situation, rent stabilization keeps New York affordable enough for hundreds of thousands of people, and people whose units are forcibly destabilized, as they can be in a few ways, are almost always have to leave.
Yeah, I'm not, of course, making a case against rent stabilization, but I was just wondering to what extent were other factors helpful, other than simply political organizing, to help set up conditions where rent stabilization could obtain. And so, like, you know, what were the property taxes in New York like? Is there a connection between rents going up and property values going up? Was rent stabilization tied to inflation? So in other words, were the landlords able to raise rents to match inflation, or roughly what kind of wage guarantees are there in New York? You know, all those kinds of things.
So the way that the Rent Guidelines Board works is you have at large members or public members who are not meant to have a particular affiliation with either side. You have two members of the Rent Guidelines Board who are supposed to represent the interests of landlords, and two who are supposed to represent the interests of tenants. Those four votes pragmatically tend to sort of cancel each other out. There's a lot of Kremlinology about how exactly it works behind the scenes. It's generally believed that the at-large members just vote the way that they're directed to by the mayor, even though this is supposedly an independent body. The idea is that they're supposed to attempt to simulate a healthy rental economy with the prices increases that they're setting for a given year in New York. So New York has technically been in a rent emergency under the state definition of having less than 5% vacancy since the 1930s. Right. So, yeah. So if the vacancy rate ever fell below that, grew above that point, or fell below that point, the sort of standard, then potentially the Rent Guidelines Board laws wouldn't apply anymore. But that's never going to happen because it's New York City. So, so de Blasio, for all of his faults, was a big time lefty mayor. And so he had a couple years of 0% increases. You see things like a 1.25% increase. It was somewhat scandalous in this past year because Eric Adams allowed for significantly higher increases than had happened in the de Blasio administration. He probably would have done so sooner, but he couldn't under the conditions of the pandemic. The rents were frozen as a condition of the pandemic. But there have been years in which, for example, I think in the Giuliani years where the increase year over year was like 8 or 9 or 10%. So that often the rent stabilized increases were worse than what you were finding in the market rate sort of thing. So yeah, it's a big complicated topic. We used to go every year.
I'm fascinated, but I think it's not very fair to you to keep talking about on that because you have a book that you want to promote here. So, one of the topics that you bring up in the book is Occupy Wall Street as another kind of activism. Again, this is, I guess, Occupy also, I think in your estimation, wasn't very close to the levers of power,
right?
And didn't really create that snowball that could roll down the hill and smash the left's enemies. What do you think went wrong with Occupy Wall Street?
I think
going back to that.
Yeah, when I argue with people who are big defenders of Occupy, I often say to them, like, I don't even know what the terms would be on which I would grade Occupy, because they did not define what their purpose was, right? Like, there's that famous quote that from one of the people there that demands, you don't want to have demands because they're disempowering. They're disempowering because power can say no to you. In other words, like, the fact that you're not going to get everything that you demand is supposedly disempowering, and that's why you supposedly shouldn't have them. It is a sort of a vague anti-capitalist sort of a thing. It was on the side of the angels in terms of directing anger at the financial industry in the United States. It obviously was a result of the financial crisis and the machinations of capital that had brought the financial crisis upon us. And I affirm the anger that was represented there, but anger is just not politics. And it's so interesting the way that we sort of have these sort of cyclical reoccurrences of problems. In the book, I quote, what's her name? Jo Freeman, I think, with the famous essay from the second wave of feminism in the 1970s, The Tyranny of Structuralistness. And her point, among others, is that, structuralistness, it's not merely, the problem is not merely that structuralistness, so no officers, no organization, no sort of process, no rules, no voting, right? Occupy didn't vote on anything. It's not just that you can't get things done, right? It's that the stated goal of not having sort of unequal power relationships within your movement is not actually served by structuralistness, because within structuralist organizations, there's all manner of unhealthy power dynamics. The fact that you don't have, officers, the fact that you don't have a president and vice president and treasurer or whatever, doesn't do away with the inherent human tendency to have sort of, people inappropriately pressuring others, or factionalization, or red baiting going on, or or accusations of working for the man or whatever. Those things still happen, but you don't have actually any structure with which to address them.
Mm-hmm. There was an attempt in Occupy to create a form of decision making that would address some of the concerns that I think were raised in your book about that. Like, for instance, they did vote. You'd have these, at least now this is in Portland, but I think it's the same. It was same in Zuccotti Park. You'd have these gatherings. People would use the human microphone to speak. There was a progressive stack. Anyone could call for a vote. Then people would vote by jazz fingers or whatever the gestures were, and someone would count them. And the only time I ever witnessed this was right before the Portland version of Occupy Wall Street got shut down by the cops. So like the night before, it's like, are we going to stay or are we going to go? And that was put to a vote. And we decided to pretend to stay.
Right.
But now in the background, they'd already started clearing out the equipment. Right. But
I don't want to slander anyone, but I stand to be corrected, but my recollection is that like they did twinkle fingers in Zuccotti Park, but no one counted anything, right? Like people would do that, but there was actually no one saying, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4 or against. So it's like, is that actually a vote, right?
No, I guess not. It was just, did it seem like the people who interpreted the twinkle fingers were interpreting it correctly according to did everyone in the crowd agree with the interpreter that it was roughly, and usually what you wanted and what happened was that there would be very little dissent, so it'd always be fairly clear anyway, like everyone. But the thing about Occupy was that there was an unstated political purpose to the Occupy Wall Street movement, which was to create a left dissident movement against the Obama administration. That was all that really was. That was like, we are the left, we are opposed to Wall Street, we're opposed to the solutions being offered by the current administration and the DC consensus, and we're out in the parks, we're occupying space outside of all of the regular politics. We're not aligned with any political party, and certainly not with Obama, but Occupy Wall Street over time became Occupy Democrats.
Right.
So that political purpose, which was sort of unstated, dissipated. But I do think that was the idea.
Well, and I will give credit where due, right? Which is that I do think that is a salutary outcome of Occupy, which is, I think this is forgotten because 2008 feels a long time ago, but there was obviously a great deal of exhaustion at the repeated horrors of the George W. Bush administration, which, for the record, for everyone at home, was vastly more destructive than anything that Trump ever did. I mean, you had the horrible quagmires in Iraq and Afghanistan, but you also had the complete inability to do anything to prevent the financial crisis. You had the federal government sitting on its hands while 1,000 people drowned in the street of New Orleans. You had the warrantless wiretapping and a whole huge surveillance network. You had torture at Guantanamo Bay and in Iraq, just again and again and again. I mean, you just had these huge problems. And coming out of that, I think a lot of really otherwise jaded sort of lefty people wanted to believe in Obama. And I say that as someone who wanted to believe in Obama, right? I mean, personally, again, like feeling totally exhausted and disillusioned by just the complete inability to make anything happen at all, despite all the hard work in the anti-war movement. And here's this guy, and he's talking about hope and change, and he's going to be the first black president, which is a big deal in and of itself. And I think what Occupy allowed people to do is it gave them permission to say, oh, right, we have Obama, it's a Democrat, and it's just business as usual, right? In other words, it gave them opportunity to say, oh, right, he's a Democrat, and no one is getting prosecuted for what happened in the financial crisis. Homeowners are not getting bailed out who have lost their homes. And it really doesn't matter that much how much hope and change you have. And I think that Occupy absolutely was effective at sort of lighting a fire that resulted. I mean, both. I think Jacobin predates Occupy, and the New Inquiry does too. But it created this sort of fertile period for socialist art and letters and ideas, which sort of got into people's brains, and that led to things like the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. So that on that score, I think Occupy is worth praising. I just don't think Occupy was ever really a political event in any meaningful sense.
Yeah, well, this podcast predated Occupy by a couple of years. Yeah, it started in 2009 in response to the economic crisis of 2008. It was Diet Soap was born as a podcast. Let me go back to some of my prepared questions here, because if we think that it didn't have a politics, could it have had politics? This is controversial, provocative question. If the aim had been to cost Obama a second term, would that have been political? If that had been the conscious aim?
So I guess that's an interesting question in the sense that I just don't define something as being meaningfully political by the goal, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I can throw a tea party in my house, and our goal can be to, prevent Joe Biden from getting the presidency in 2024. It doesn't make it a political event. What makes it a political event, and this is a theme that goes throughout the book, is having a coherent idea about what you want to achieve, some sense of how you might go about achieving it, and what the long-term plan is. I just wrote this piece on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which a lot of people didn't like, but I think some people misunderstood what I was saying and said, oh, you're asking a single congresswoman to be able to create all this change. And that's not the point, right? You don't have to be able to win. We're mostly always going to lose. The point is you have to articulate a theory of change, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I am now quite jaded about the sort of Bernie Sanders sort of thing, but the Bernie Sanders sort of plan made a ton of sense. This guy's uniquely charismatic. He has an immense amount of credibility. He has all kinds of great opinions in terms of healthcare and labor issues and et cetera. And we elect him to be president, and we sort of figure things out from there. And we've got a guy with a real lever on the hands of power. That's a theory of politics, and it could have happened, right? That there is a world in which Bernie Sanders is elected president, and a lot of things are different. Let's go to the park and parade around with signs that say shit is fucked up and bullshit, but have no sense of are we at all interfacing with electoral politics? If we're not, that's cool. That there's a long history of that. Then what are we doing? What is the particular social outcome we're trying to reach? And to me, like, I think that you can see Occupy I'm saying this in sympathetic terms as like a cool bit of like protest performance art, right? It's a bunch of people getting together saying, hey, we should all be mad about the way things are. And that did help to convince a lot of people of that. But there was no theory of politics involved with Occupy.
What about the George Floyd protests? You write about those protests in the book. You have a section called "Riots Don't Work." Do you think that in a strange way, maybe the George Floyd protests were a repeat of Occupy?
Well, it's interesting. There's sort of like the immediate moment, right? Like one of the things that I'm not sure if it made it into the book, but you don't expect people to sort of see George Floyd get killed in May, and then like a week after that happens, have a sort of fully formed sort of political plan. Right. You would like for something to sort of emerge organically from the protests and from all of the work that was happening. I think part of what made the sort of arc of this thing quite sort of tragic to me was the sort of gradual long-term understanding that, oh, okay, we're just never going to get the plan B, right? So you have this horrible event, and you have this extraordinarily sympathetic and understandable expression of rage in the streets over the serial murder of Black people by the cops. And then you have a unique moment in American history in terms of everyone in society seemingly paying attention to a reaction like this, and wanting to, and many people, a huge portion of the American public, wanting to contribute to sort of what they're attempting to get. I think it's easy to forget. There was a period of about a month when a majority of Republicans in polling were showing support for the George Floyd protest, which in America in the 21st century, if you get bipartisan consensus about what's so obviously a left-leaning political sort of tendency, that's remarkable. But it just never sort of coalesced and came together in anything. I write in the book extensively about the fact that I think the media fixation on the defund the police demand was just a truly terrible turn of events for this movement. I've said before that I almost suspect that the defund the police demand became so central because it was unlikely to ever be taken seriously. And what I mean by that is, if you have a set of sort of reforms and there's a chance as a political movement you can achieve them, but there's a chance you might not achieve them, right? If it's in play, if your activism, if your outreach, if your organizing, if your political work, if that stuff really matters, and you might be able to get something and you might not be able to get something out of the system, then that's a very scary scenario to be in, right? If you think, oh, we can get meaningful reform, but we have to be good at this. We have to be smart. We have to do good politics. We have to form coalitions, and we have to break bread with people we might not want to, and we have to reach across the aisle when it's strategically necessary, et cetera, then you can screw it up and get it wrong and not get what you want, and that's scary. But if, on the other hand, you make as your central demand the abolition of the police, knowing that, a tiny percentage of Democrats were polling in favor of that at the time, then you've kind of let yourself off the hook, right? Because if you make a demand that has no chance of coming true, you can't be held accountable when it doesn't pass, because it's never going to pass anyway. And so there is a sense in which, yes, the sort of BLM protests of 2020 were like Occupy, in that it never really coalesced into anything. I think the tragedy is just that there was just vastly more public sentiment in support of BLM. And then the other tragedy is, of course, that a lot of it devolved into grift, you know.
Well, remind me, because, you know, I'm trying to keep the timeline straight in my head. When did Bernie Sanders concede that he had lost the primaries? And when did the George Floyd protests hit the streets?
That is a good question, but certainly Bernie conceded before the heart of the George Floyd protests. Yeah. I want to say that so Obama, I talk about this in the book, but Obama struck the sort of famous backdoor deal where Bernie had just won Nevada, I believe. And the New York Times ran a piece saying that he's the favorite in the race, and it may be difficult for other Democrats to stop his momentum. And immediately thereafter, Barack Obama, according to multiple reports, worked the phones and talked to a bunch of minor candidates like Pete Buttigieg and convinced them to drop out in order to rally around
all of them. Everyone dropped out.
Right. Yeah. Certainly that happened before George Floyd died. I think that was February or March, but I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. And then after that, it became pretty obvious at the very next primary, which I think was in South Carolina, right? Where Biden won his first primary. Wait, I think the calls came after Biden's win. But I think that's right. But in any case, it became clear that Sanders didn't have much the same shot we thought he had, and it was, and also once Sanders was running just against Biden, his campaign was just different. He didn't seem to want it anymore. I don't know.
Yeah. It's important to say, I think this is lost. Biden was considered kind of a minor dark horse candidate at the beginning of the cycle. And if you actually go back and look at sort of mainstream, I think there's the sort of there's been this misconception that's grown that like, oh, Biden was always the sort of the establishment guy, and you know the establishment just got what it wanted eventually. Biden only became the establishment's guy after a lot of people dropped out because it turned out that they weren't viable. And I mean, the knock on Biden was obvious. He was too old, right? And there was a sense that he was yesterday's news. He was Obama's VP, and that just wasn't going to fly. So it's important to remember that because, a point that I keep making, and I think people need to understand is, in 2016, Bernie Sanders significantly outperformed his fundamentals, right? In other words, if you look at the composition of the electorate, the kind of voters that he did well with, the states that were necessary for him in order to secure the nomination, the amount of money that he had raised, and the size of his operation, etc. It was so shocking because the fundamentals were really against him. In 2020, Bernie Sanders badly underperformed his fundamentals. The Brookings Institution ran a big, long analysis of the different states, how he had polled, the size of his infrastructure there, the amount of money spent on media and stuff, and he just performed really badly compared to how he should have, which should inform all of us about sort of moving forward. I think that he and his team were badly stung in 2016 by constantly being called racist and sexist. And I think that he lost some of his sort of universalizing class-focused appeal when doing that. But also young people didn't turn out once again.
Yeah. So the reason I brought up Bernie Sanders, and this will be for the first half, this will be maybe our last go round before we head over to the Patreon Parrot Room, is because if we can imagine that the George Floyd protests had emerged during the Democratic primaries rather than after they had really been resolved, would there have been more of a chance for them to become political as something within the Democratic Party that was being contested? Or do you think Sanders would have ended up having to embrace embrace defund the police, and give sort of give Biden or whoever was on the other side there the sane position. Was the defund the police as a far left stance within the Democratic Party, just very so convenient that it would have been unavoidable for someone like Sanders?
Yeah, that is a very fair question. I mean, you would think that if you were just sort of, let's say that George Floyd happens in 2019 instead of 2020, right? There is a old New York Times piece on the candidates in the Democratic race that really brings me a lot of heartache when I see it, because there's got to be like 20 candidates or something like that listed, and it's like, okay, which of these candidates wants Medicare for all, and who will only settle, and who's willing to settle for a public option? And it's like this, it's like a dispatch from another world, right? Where any of that stuff is possible. There's a good chance that in the early stages of the primary, where healthcare had been the litmus test, that police reform becomes the litmus test. And I don't see Bernie Sanders personally saying we have to defund the police, right? No. It's just not his style. I mean, you'd think that a scenario like that would benefit the most prominent Black candidate, but unfortunately, she was a notoriously aggressive prosecutor. So that's a good counterfactual. I don't know that how it would have gone.
Well, I mean, what Sanders would have done if he had been consistent would have run on how his economic vision would have changed the conditions and made it made these confrontations less likely, along with, some community oversight of the police and more strict and thoroughgoing consequences for police brutality, right?
But I mean, we know how it turned out in real life, right? Which is that Democrats didn't really have to interface with a lot of the specific demands of Black Lives Matter, because they were running on "We're not Trump," right? Right. And
just like Clinton did during the LA riots, right? Clinton came out and he turned neoliberalism into some great democratic progressive policy. Like, I'll bring Black capitalism into the mix.
If you don't want to hash out a very sticky political question, like the fact that, okay, the activist class of your party is demanding defunding the police. I mean, again, like I think I said, like Planned Parenthood, which has absolutely no purview in the world of criminal justice at all, put out a defund the police statement, right? Like defunding the police became widely accepted by all manner of institutions in American life, and by a lot of politicians who, now wouldn't go near it. But when you have this other guy's a fascist, then it's an extremely convenient way to avoid the difficult conversation, right? Like all you have to say is, I'm not going to talk about defund the police today, but the other guy is an insane fascist, and so we need to get rid of him, which is convenient.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.